censorship that we had both in Ireland and Britain during the Troubles. In Ireland from the very early 1970s onwards, and in Britain from the late 1980s under Thatcher. But much more insidious was the self-censorship that flowed from that official censorship. And that was much more difficult to tackle. That's the censorship which I think is the real problem at the moment in the United States, particularly in relation to its foreign advantages. So, journalists would, very few journalists would write about it, very few journalists would admit it, and those who cooperated with the system of censorship, are not going to, have not stood up and said, listen, we were wrong. At least not to my knowledge. Yeah, this is the past, and let's forget it and let's move on, That's the type of attitude. Yes?
Excuse me. I want to thank you for coming, and I like to say I'm glad to see somebody here that speaks truth to power, and we need more of that here in the United States too. I wanted to ask you, what is it that, do you think that, you've been around for years, what is it that you think makes people just conform, and is it cowardice? Is it
fear and cowardice, and careers. Most of the journalists who cooperated with censorship in Ireland did so because if they didn't, they'd get a bad name and they would lose their job, or they wouldn't get promotion, or whatever. And that happened to a lot of people, who did stand up against it. I mean, there were people in RT, for example, the odd journalists here and there, who actually defied the censorship laws, but they lost their jobs. So there was a penalty to be paid for taking the principled stand. And most journalists learned that, and they just cooperated with the system. And the easiest way to cooperate with the system was not tell the story.
right?
Yes.
How would you contrast the Irish situation to the part-time council?
In what sense?
Well, I think that there are parallels. You had a situation where a lot of people did a lot of questionable things, dirty things, a lot of things. And then after Mandela, there was a process, and stuff came out. There was an amnesty. Is there parallels there?
In terms of a need for a truth process,
yeah.
There is most definitely a need for a truth process in all times. Whether you get it is a different question.
So the difference really is in South Africa you had one, and in Ireland you don't.
Well, if you read the accounts of the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, they were less than satisfactory. A very, very small minority of white policemen came forward to confess their wrong deeds, as it were. The vast majority did not. It was limited in scope, and whether it was more than a cosmetic exercise is I think a moot point or an arguable point. And that's the problem with these types of truth processes. And how do you persuade people to come forward and tell the truth unless you have sanctions, unless you have essentially the proof against people? And if you have that proof, you need to have a truth process in the first place. In other words, if you could prove that these policemen had done this, that, and the other, why not just bring them in front of the court and try them, rather than have a truth process? Yes?
Did the U.S. relationship with Great Britain, do you think, during that time, during the 70s and the 80s, really result in a less than vigorous pursuit of the truth by the American press as well?
Yeah, I think so. The example of the New York Times is always cited. A paper that was very pro-British Anglophilia, reigned in the New York Times. I don't think there's much doubt about that. There was a willingness to take the British line that they were trying to keep this two bunches of irrational Irishmen from killing each other. They were the piggy in the middle, as they used to say. That it was mostly a religious conflict. It was really all about the lack of integrated education, which was nonsense. It wasn't about that. I think they did take that very sort of simplistic view, and it's still stubbornly there. I find it all the time. I come across it from American journalists about have the other schools changed? In other words, this is a community relations problem, and you get kids together in school, and they learn that the other guy is not a monster, and they learn to live with each other, and therefore you get peace that way. That's based on a total misunderstanding of what the Northern Ireland problem is about. The Northern Ireland problem is about the unequal distribution of political power and economic power, same as it is in this country, same as it is in South Africa, same as it is in most places, particularly in countries where the basis of that conflict has been land theft. And land theft is really the root of the Irish problem. The idea, the 1 million Protestants who live in the north of Ireland didn't get there by accident. They were transplanted by Britain in the Stuart era, early 17th century mostly, late Tudor period, late 16th century as well, for two reasons. One, because they were put in a part of Ireland in the north, which was the furthest away from English reach, and it's where all the troublesome people were, still is, of course. It's where the centre of opposition to English rule in Ireland was, in the north. And also, of course, they put them there to act as a buffer against any French, Spanish, Catholic invasion of Britain by the back door of Ireland. And in order to transplant them, they had to be given land. And where did that land come from, except from the people who lived there in the first place? I think it's especially true in conflicts which have their origins in that type of situation, that you get these very distinct problems.
I think they even trivialize it simply by, it's describing it as trouble, so almost make it sound like an inconvenience rather than human rights, civil rights.
That's right. I mean, I went to Northern Ireland in 1966, just at the very, very start of the civil rights movement. Within 3 years the troubles had started, but they started off very peacefully with marches demanding the right to vote, the right to have a decent home, the right to have a decent job, stuff like this. The campaign was modeled very consciously on the Black American Civil Rights campaign. The same slogans were used, the same songs were used, right? So it was always regarded quite clearly by those involved in it as a political struggle. And yet the tenor of coverage in the United States consistently and persistently over the years has been to see it as a community relations problem, which it's about getting people to live together and understand each other. I'm sorry, it's not. It's more complicated than that. Yes, this lady.
I'd just like to add, I was involved in the early days of the campaign here in the United States, and we were in touch with people in the North regularly, and we'd be reading in the New York Times how they would report it, but we knew what was really happening, and it just added fuel to our fire in campaigning through those days. And one other, to the point about like South Africa, you read the northern papers now every day. Every single headline is still a war going on. It's not a military campaign, but it is a war over the past because they have not yet agreed on methods to deal with the history. And people are still fighting over parades and flags and emblems and dates. So it's as if nothing had happened. So it is a war of words and a really serious war going on right now because nobody has done what they attempted even a little bit in South Africa to try and deal with the past. And
this gentleman here, and then I'll come to you.
I just want to make a comment on this part of the conversation. I agree with your premise that the American relationship with the Brits had a lot to do with it. But in the 70s, when I was attending St. Peter's, I was inclined to get a little bit involved in some of this, and since my ancestry was Irish, that's where I was going. But my family and the Irish circle that they were around discouraged any interest in this. I don't know the whole story because they wouldn't talk about it. All I knew is that they all felt that whatever side they were on, they had suffered too greatly and lost too much, after 1916, and therefore they didn't want to know anything about any unrest, any troubles in Ireland afterwards. And I'm just wondering, was that unique to this little circle I was in, or did you see that throughout the country over here?
Well, I can't really speak too much about Irish America. I'm a relatively recent arrival here, so my expertise and knowledge is pretty limited. But I understand what you're talking about. I mean, I remember coming across the story of this family in East Tyrone, which is a very, very strong IRA area, produced some of the worst violence and the most violent IRA units were based in East Tyrone from time to time. About this particular family that wouldn't have anything to do with what was going on, and people were somewhat surprised at that because they had been involved in the 1920s. And so I met someone who explained it to me. He said it was because of what happened in the 1920s that they weren't going to go through it again because they felt that it would end up in the same way. People would die, they would make sacrifices, they would go to jail, and at the end of the day it would be for nothing because someone would come along who would, quote, sell them out. Yes?
I was going to ask you, how many, are there like younger people that are interested in the story, in finding out the reason I'm asking is because I find that, much like even a woman who just spoke, when people have gone through very tragic situations or like experiences, they have a tendency when they move on or move to another country or whatever, because they kind of want to bury it and forget about it or whatever it needs to be, and therefore the history is not told or moved forward, and you get somewhat of a break in interest until maybe much younger people come and they really are interested in how to investigate what the truth is or where they come from or what the issues were.
You mean in Ireland or here?
Could you repeat the question a little bit?
Yes.
We can't hear it. Ed, could you repeat the question?
Basically, what you're trying to ask is are there a lot of people, the young generation? It's just like the history of slavery. Quite often, grandparents, great-grandparents, they may not want to talk about it because it's so painful. And so, just like the woman she just spoke about it, as a younger person, you have parents that really want to deal with it. So, quite often, not until you're a few generations out, the younger people start questioning what was the real history. Are younger people interested in it now?
I think that type of phenomenon that you're talking about is really triggered by events. If it's in the news, I think people will want to know what's going on. I think, for example, my wife Joan will maybe bear witness to this, that when the trouble started, or when the civil rights movement started in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it re-stimulated interest in the Irish American community. And incidentally, Boston College row, if you like, over these subpoenas did something similar in the last 2 or 3 years or so. Irish American groups, which have been more or less quiescent as a result of the peace process, suddenly burst back into life. They had an issue to campaign about and were getting involved. And I think something similar happens in communities when what's happening back in Ireland is in the headlines, is in the news. Otherwise, I think people will lose interest and lose contact with their past.
When we first started the civil rights support groups here in the United States, it was in the late 1960s as things were about to erupt there. And you know the history of the late 1960s. I mean, we were watching the movements here, and so we were a bunch of young people. But Irish America has always campaigned. But at that point, it was mainly very elderly people who were totally startled by these upstarts that we would be on protest marches on Fifth Avenue and doing different kinds of things compared to their traditional methods of organizing. So, I mean, eventually everybody got involved, but that was a new brand of people. But, things are quiescent now, and there weren't that many campaigns until the thing over Boston College. But just to tell you, in Ireland, don't forget, I mean, like people get involved in their lives and they settle in, and like the struggle is over. When Ed's book on the Secret Lives came out, it was made into a film, which won the Irish kind of Oscar. But the night it was showing in RTE, the people over there were watching, had a Twitter feed, and we were getting, somebody was sending us the Twitter feed, and it was from all these young people over the island saying, is that what it was all about? You know, it went on for 30-odd years. So you have people growing up that did know. So Southerners are now saying, oh, is that why they were fighting? Is that what it was for? Because what Ed was saying, the media still has not explored it on the island, right? And his film was one of the first to actually get there. And watching young people's Twitter feed was a very revealing thing to answer your question.
Yeah.
This gentleman here has been trying to...
I'm kind of interested about the role of Boston College on this. Looking on my smartphone and reading it. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, it really seems like Boston College. I mean, it's a betrayal of I guess, kind of an agreement they had, or someone at Boston College had with you and your co-author. And can you talk a little bit?
Well, that's certainly the way that we felt. You know, let me just start this story with an anecdote from the beginning of this episode. It started in May 2011. I got a phone call from a contact whose name I will never ever reveal, in Boston College, a friend of mine, who said, listen, I want to tell you something, and I'm paraphrasing. I want to tell you something, but I don't want you involved in this, right? Because this is dangerous stuff. He said, they've just had subpoenas served on the archive, and they want the interviews of Brendan Hughes, and they want the interviews of Durban Price. And you know, I was stunned. This was not supposed to happen. We given all these assurances from Boston College, and more or less this came out as a block out of the blue. So what did I do? The first thing I did was to phone the University Council, legal office at Boston College, to ask them really one question: are you going to fight this? Are you going to resist it? And I rang and rang and rang, and she was not available. She was on the other line, and so on. I just eventually gave up, and I phoned the librarian at Boston College and explained to him, and this was the guy who was nominally looking after the archive, it was under his care.